Hi, my name is Christine. I'm with the Disability Action Center here in Moscow, Idaho. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about boundaries, specifically for people with disabilities who maybe have been told that their thoughts, their feelings, their personal limits, and their own autonomy maybe aren't taken as seriously as non-disabled people. This is part of a multi-video collaboration with Alternatives to Violence on the Palouse. Each month there's going to be a video about a different topic. So this month is boundaries. So we're going to go through first what boundaries are, just a very simple definition and how you can think about boundaries, because it's sometimes kind of vague. You probably heard the word a lot, but maybe you don't know exactly what that entails. Examples of boundaries, states of boundaries. So boundaries can come in many different levels almost, and that's what we refer to as states. Boundary violations, what that might look like, as well as consent, because often violations of boundaries are just violations of consent and disrespect. Private versus public behaviors and how that ties into boundaries. Identifying and setting boundaries, because that tends to be the hardest part for everyone. Really, it is the hardest part in general. And then examples of all of those things, especially examples specific to, unique experiences that people with disabilities might run into. So we can define boundaries using a few different kinds of definitions that all kind of work together. I think of boundaries as limits that you identify on your own and apply through action and communication. So they're kind of like invisible lines that separate you and your feelings and your comfort level from everything else that's maybe like outside of that. Boundaries tell other people how they can treat us and how they can't, the kind of treatment we prefer and the kind of treatment that we would rather not put up with. So that's boundaries. You can think of boundaries as different types. Here we have 6 different types. So first, and probably the most, I think, common boundary to think of, it would be physical boundaries. So that's your body, your physical space. That's, who can touch you, where, when, how, and then also just people who are very close to you. Like maybe, you're in a grocery store, you're in line, you don't want the person behind you breathing down your neck. That's a pretty common boundary. Boundaries relating to your time, how you use your time, how other people have decided they can use your time or solicit your time, and then prioritizing time in a way that works for you and is valuable to you. And we'll go through specific examples of all these kinds later once we get through all of them. There are intellectual boundaries, so that's boundaries relating to your thoughts, your ideas, your opinions, and then also boundaries of how you approach new information. Are you very open and understanding? Do you like to do a lot of research? Are you kind of, skeptical? Things like that. And then emotional boundaries, a little bit similar maybe to intellectual boundaries because it's very interior to you, but these are boundaries about your emotional well-being, how you feel, emotional sharing, how you communicate to others how you feel. Maybe there's some people you do that with and some people you don't. That's a boundary. Sexual boundaries, this can also be a physical boundary, but it can also be an emotional boundary. It can be a boundary relating to your time. A lot of these can overlap and be certain and be multiple things. But sexual boundaries refer to any boundary that protects your needs and your safety sexually, as well as sexuality, which isn't just the physical act of sex, it's also your orientation and your behavior and identity, things like that. Material boundaries, your, physical items that you own, as well as your finances. So like money, like a bank account would be material. And then also like clothes, assets like your car, your house if you own a house. Those are all material items that you should have boundaries with. Who can use your car and when, if anyone can. Who can use your personal items, who can, borrow clothes, things like that. But it's also who can access your bank account, if anyone can, who can, in an emergency, like who's in your will and testament, those are all material boundaries. Go through specific examples of the types. And then some of these again are like disability specific or maybe common that you might run into or have felt before. I tried to pick things that were pretty general so that they were a lot easier to understand. But an example of a physical boundary, maybe you feel fine if your parents help you get dressed, but that isn't something that you want your personal care assistant to do. So you have a caregiver and you have your parents and you're comfortable with your parents helping you to get dressed if you need the help that day, but that's not something that, that's a boundary you have with your personal care assistant. They don't help you with dressing. Examples of, sexual boundaries. Maybe you're in a relationship, but you two, you're not really ready to take it to any physical level. You just like to hang out, maybe hold hands every once in a while, and that's what works for you. There's no reason to do anything else if you don't want to. And that's a boundary you've communicated. Say, I'm not interested in that right now. But maybe, in a different situation, maybe you are, and you have to stay communicating about what's okay and what's not physically. And that, again, consent. Just saying, is this okay? Yes or no. Intellectual, again, maybe a little vague. So an example would be, you really like to learn new things. You like to hear what people have to say. You like to ask people their opinions, but maybe you wait to form your own opinions until you've done, some research. Maybe you try not to chime in on a debate that you don't have any personal experience in. Boundaries relating to time, that could be, maybe you get home from work or school and you just need an hour alone to decompress. Tell your family, tell your roommates, tell your partner, unless there's an emergency, I just need 40 minutes by myself just to get the day off, That's a boundary of time you've set. You've identified that that's a need of yours, and you've set that boundary with the people who would need to know about it. Material boundaries, maybe you have a pair of glasses. In my experience, people with glasses don't really like them being taken off their face randomly. That's a material boundary. This is a thing that I own and it's mine, and I don't want you to touch it without my consent, And then a financial example would be, my parents, they have access to my bank account because they help me save, but we've decided that they're not allowed to take any money out of my account. That could be another example. If your parents have access to your bank account, you might want to set boundaries with them about what they can actually do with that access. And then an example of emotional boundaries, again, sort of like intellectual, like I said earlier, where it's kind of more about how you want to spend the energy that your brain and your feelings, that's where the boundaries come in. So a boundary that we had written down was maybe you like sharing your experience as a disabled person, but if you're in a conversation with someone who seems to be just kind of pitying you for how you live your life, they're not really understanding that you're independent, you're doing what you do, you're having a great time, you're living your life. They can't see anything past that, even if you're being vulnerable and you're being, you're investing emotional energy into that, and they're not reacting in a savory way, then shut down the conversation. And then we were talking about states of boundaries, so the kind of rigidity of a boundary. And then when we're talking about rigid boundaries, which are, you know, there's no room for negotiation, nothing can get through these boundaries. It's not, you know, like, I'm not here to have a discussion about this boundary. I've set this boundary and you have to respect that boundary. Boundaries can be more flexible, where this is sort of a middle ground between rigid and then the third one we'll talk about. But a flexible boundary would be, there's room for discussion about it. And that doesn't always have to be a bad thing. That doesn't mean that you're letting things slide. It means that you are open to kind of molding the boundary in a way that works for both parties. Permeable boundaries. Something that's permeable is something that's easy to get through. So if you imagine like a paper towel and then you had someone just like pour water on top of it, the water goes out the other side. A paper towel is very permeable. So a permeable boundary would be a boundary where things are getting let slide. You know, there's maybe it's not very flexible because you're not this isn't a compromise you've decided to make. This is just a boundary that people keep disrespecting. These are lines that people keep crossing even though you've tried to set it as a boundary. And let's talk about some boundary violations, just some examples of common ways that you might experience the line being crossed. This is types of abuse: physical abuse, sexual abuse, any unwanted touch, and it can even be like seemingly like innocuous things like hugging or like kissing on the cheek. That's still unwanted touch if you don't want it. Asking a lot of personal questions, asking for a lot of personal information when it's not someone who needs to know that information, that's crossing a boundary. That's, TMI. Even sharing of a lot of personal information. If you're just in the grocery store and the person next to you in line is telling you like their social security number, that's crossing a boundary for you because you don't need to know that. Using abusive language, this is language that can be offensive, harmful, threatening, racist, misogynistic, hateful, indulging of desires at the expense of someone else. So this is something we talk about more when we go into public and private appropriateness and boundaries. That's basically just because you really, really, really want to do something, like maybe, you really, really want to hold your girlfriend's hand because you love your girlfriend, and you really want to hold her hand because you just want to be close to her, but she's not into it today. She's like, maybe she's a little off, like something, like she's having a bad day, she needs personal space, but you keep going for her hand anyway. You're crossing her boundary, even if it's, even if, she's completely okay with that on any other day. It's just today, that's a boundary for today, and you are indulging your desire to hold her hand at her own expense because it's pissing her off. So that would be an example of that. Again, kind of off of that, not listening when someone says no, not respecting consent. When someone tells you, or you tell someone this behavior is not okay, and they keep doing it anyway, that is a boundary violation. Expecting a favor exchange. This one is, I think, a little more on a case-by-case basis. Maybe if it's like someone does something for you just to get something out of you later, it would be like that. If someone is like, oh, hey, remember when I gave you a ride last week? Like, do you think you can loan me $100? Like, that's a boundary violation. Dismissing or ignoring feelings and concerns. That goes, again, just to not listening to you, being kind of neglectful, not taking it seriously. That can be a boundary violation. Examples of boundary violations, just little tidbits that we took. I was out of my wheelchair, someone took it away without telling me. I don't know where it is. They didn't let me know, they didn't ask me. That's a huge boundary violation. That can be a material boundary violation. It can also be a physical boundary violation, because not only is that the wheelchair an item you own, but it's also an item that can feel like an extension of yourself. It's an extreme boundary violation. Someone else has access to my bank account and they've been making decisions about the money I make without including me. It's pretty obvious. You shouldn't be using money, someone else's money, for something that they're not privy to. And then another one, I use a communication board / type to talk, and my personal care assistant doesn't wait for me to finish my sentences before they make a decision about what to do. That's another boundary violation. That's being neglectful, that's being dismissive of someone's feelings and concerns. You're not taking their opinion into account. That's an intellectual boundary violation. Public and private boundaries. There are a lot of common boundaries that most people share, or that we can assume most people share, that help us sort of navigate the world socially. So again, a really common one is that I don't like to be touched by strangers. So, you know, as a general rule, I don't touch strangers either. So we can go through behaviors that are okay in public, very common behaviors that are okay in public, behaviors that are okay in private, and then behaviors that would not be great in public for anyone involved, really. So some totally a-okay public behaviors: courtesy talk, small talk, very light talk, talking about like the weather, general information like my name is, my favorite color is, things like that. Usually this kind of talk doesn't require a lot of emotional or mental or intellectual effort, and it also doesn't require you or the other person to share anything super personal. Consensual behaviors, consensual physical behaviors like handshakes and high fives. Usually you can tell because both people are going in for it at the same time. So if someone is going in for a high five and you're cool with it too, totally a-okay. If you're going in for a high five and someone is not reciprocating that, then maybe that's a boundary. Maybe they're not into that. Stimming behaviors like, you know, interacting with fidget items, leg shaking, doodling, swaying, rocking, hand flapping, all very okay public behaviors. Behaviors that would be inappropriate in public, again, touching other people without their consent, disclosing intimate and personal information, we've discussed this, screaming, hitting, harming yourself or others. Okay, private behaviors, so getting dressed and undressed, that's something you do in your room, in your house. Showers and personal hygiene, interacting with your private parts, your genitals, masturbation, or just like, you know, wiping, cleaning, checking to make sure you're all good down there. That very private behavior. And then conversations with sensitive information. So, you know, if you're filling out the FAFSA or you're doing your taxes, do that at home. Maybe not in a very public area if you're going through some, because it can be sensitive information like your social security number and your full legal name and every school you've ever went to and your address and your job, things like that. But it can also just be super personal information about your life, things that maybe would be more appropriate to talk to with a really close friend or a really close family member or like a therapist. Those are more private behaviors, you know. And private behaviors can be done not just alone. Now we can talk about identifying and setting boundaries. To identify a boundary, everyone has boundaries. It's just about knowing which of your feelings and your preferences are boundaries. So you can just think about any personal limits that you already have, again, when it comes to your things, your body, your time. Just think about your sort of your own limits and your own needs regarding those. If you notice that you have certain emotional reactions to, you know, these things being dismissed or neglected or disrespected, then that could indicate you have a boundary relating to it. I do have an example. I'll go through an example first of someone kind of realizing they have a boundary. So Max's best friend Alex stayed over at Max's house yesterday, and this morning Max discovered that Alex had used his toothbrush without asking or mentioning it. Max just found out that, oh, Alex used my toothbrush. Okay. If Alex had asked Max for a toothbrush, then Max would have found him an extra one, or they would have gone to the store. But Alex didn't say anything, so now Max just kind of feels a little angry and kind of grossed out, honestly. So that's Max in the story identifying a boundary. To set a boundary, it comes down to honest communication. So that's being very straightforward, but also very clear. You know, you don't want to just go up to someone and say, I'm mad at you. You're gonna have to elaborate a little bit, usually. You can even write out what you want to say before you say it, especially if you're kind of at an emotional high. Writing it out can help you sort of get all of those emotions on paper and sort through everything and be like, okay, here's what I actually wanted to say now that I'm a little more clear and level-headed. To set a boundary with them, you first have to tell them what the boundary even is. A lot of the times, hopefully they just didn't know. Hopefully they weren't trying to hurt you. Hopefully it just was something that they weren't aware of. So you have to tell them, this is a boundary that I have. So Max would say, you know, I prefer that other people don't use my personal hygiene items, like my toothbrush. That's a boundary I have. After identifying the boundary to the person, you would explain how you felt when the boundary was crossed. It can help open up lines of understanding. You know, it can help kind of foster empathy, because sometimes people just don't understand why it's such a big deal. They wouldn't know. They don't, because maybe they don't feel frustrated or upset when that same thing happens to them. Maybe Alex doesn't care if anyone uses his toothbrush, you know? So Max has to say, like, that makes me feel really grossed out when you do that. It's also important to make sure that the person you're talking to knows that they aren't being like attacked, because you don't want them to become defensive, or else they're not going to hear it very well. We want the whole situation just to be pretty calm, because it usually goes better that way, you know? You can end the whole thing by requesting that they first respect the boundary in the future, and then two, kind of brainstorm with them ways that they can do that. So we can go back to the toothbrush example. Max says, Alex, I know that you needed a toothbrush last night, but I prefer it if other people don't use my personal items. So first, Max has established understanding and empathy, saying like, I know you needed this last night, I understand that, but he's also identifying his boundaries. I prefer it if other people don't use my personal items. I felt uncomfortable that you used my toothbrush without asking, because my toothbrush is a very personal item. So again, saying how he feels. Next time, please tell me and I can find you what you need. So that's letting Alex know how he can respect this boundary in the future, and also what Max can do. Moving on, setting boundaries can be complicated. It's not always going to be as easy as saying what you want and then getting it. Some people are going to be disrespectful. Some people might just not get it. Even if you tell them how you feel, they're just not going to understand, like, what's the big deal, you know? Some people just aren't able to make that sort of empathic connection if they really don't think it's a big deal. And this is why open and non-judgmental communication is pretty important, because it just makes the conversation easier, and it makes people a little more open. If you notice that someone is still crossing your boundaries after you've set them, or if you find that you're still crossing someone's boundaries after it has been set, there's a few points you might want to think about. So just because a boundary doesn't make sense to someone else doesn't mean it's invalid. You can respect a boundary even if you don't understand it or if you don't like it. Just because you don't think it matters doesn't mean you can't respect the boundary. There are some boundaries that are mostly preferences. So these would be flexible boundaries. They're also context dependent, meaning that they change from situation to situation. These boundaries can be negotiated respectfully. We identify out of the boundaries you have which might be more flexible than others, so that you're kind of ready for that conversation if it ever arises. You and others have the right to cut contact with anyone who's not respecting a boundary or who continuously crosses a boundary. If you don't understand someone's boundary and you keep disrespecting it, they might cut you off. That's a very real consequence, and that's something that they have every right to do, because at some point there's really no other option. You know, you have to protect your safety, because at the end of the day, boundaries are just guidelines to your safety. Boundaries are meant to protect your safety. Okay, let's do an activity. Well, you're doing an activity. First, just identify one boundary. Doesn't have to be super serious or complex. Just it can be something simple. First thing that comes to mind. To help you set a boundary, again, just think about, you know, your personal limits, your personal values, how you felt before when certain things have happened. Use those as guidelines. We're gonna write out a short little message, a fake message to someone as if they've crossed this boundary. The message should include the boundary that was crossed, about how it was crossed, then how you felt when the boundary was crossed, you know, frustrated, disrespected, angry, and then ways that this person can respect your boundaries in the future. And sometimes that last part, ways that this person can respect your boundaries in the future, again, is something that you might have to also work with them on. After writing the message, was there anything that you kind of got stuck on? Anything that felt difficult to write out? Maybe, you know, expressing the feelings was hard. Maybe even just saying, this is a boundary that I have, was difficult, because maybe you've never done that before. It can be hard. You just have to keep doing it. It's the muscle, you know? You have to keep practicing it, and then it won't hurt. And then, do you feel confident that you could tell this to someone in real life, or relay this message to someone in real life who has crossed a real boundary? Is this something that you could, maybe not easily, but something that you know you could establish as an important boundary? And then again, like I said earlier, boundaries protect your safety, and your safety is important, and it can be hard to set boundaries, to identify boundaries. It can be hard to communicate with others if you don't want to like rock the boat or hurt their feelings or like lose a friend if it's something really serious. But at the end of the day, your safety is the most important thing. I think all we have is a survey. This is just a little 10 questions. 7 of them are multiple choice, so it should be really short. It should only take like 2-3 minutes. It's just asking about your personal, it's also optional. You don't have to do this. This is just something that I added for fun. It's just asking about your personal experience with boundaries so far. If you ever want to look into local resources, if you're in Idaho or specifically in Moscow, you can always call Disability Action Center, or you can call Alternatives to Violence on the Palouse. So yeah, that is it. Thank you so much for watching.